notorious Ringo Kid.
My friends just call me Ringo. Nickname I had as a kid. Right name's Henry.
Seems to me I knew your family, Henry. Didn't I fix your arm once when you bucked off a horse?
Are you Doc Boone?
I certainly am. Now, let's see. I just been honorably discharged from the Union Army after the War of the Rebellion.
You mean the war for the Southern Confederacy, sir?
I mean nothing of the kind, sir.
That was my kid brother broke his arm. You did a good job, Doc, even if you was drunk.
Thank you, son. Professional compliments are always pleasing.
Yes, they are.
What happened to that boy whose arm I fixed?
He was murdered.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Not Content Podcast. My name is Jerome Cuson. We are continuing our examination of the year 1939, regarded as one of the best film years of all time. Over the first 2 weeks, we have discussed two very notable films, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Only Angels Have Wings. This week, we are taking a look at John Ford's classic, Stagecoach. My co-host, of course, is Brian. You can find us through Apple and Spotify. Please leave a 5-star reviews to get those algorithms going. Brian, I can also say that we are on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to us on YouTube. Give the video a thumbs up. Brian, you are going to be so proud of me. I forgot to mention this last week, but I nuked my Twitter account. Aren't you proud of me? Please clap.
I haven't been on social media since Election Day, and I think I made the right decision. I don't know when I'll go back, but...
I mean, if you want to abandon social media altogether, I think that is totally acceptable. But I think nuking your Twitter account is probably the best idea.
We'll see, because I have a lot of references that kind of go back to my tweets from the past or whatever, but I don't know. Just not being on social media since the election has been actually like a breath of fresh air. And
you're like Thanos at the end of Infinity War when he's at his little farm.
Yeah, and like whenever I was looking up AEW news, usually I would go on Twitter, but now I just do the old 2002 thing and just type in AEW news and look for any website that's got any news. So, and then I got to make sure it came.
Got me strange. We're gonna start going to websites again, like it's 2002, like you said.
Yeah, because we're just trying to avoid Twitter. That cesspool. And yes, I've blocked about 10,000 people in about 8 years, but that's probably a low number compared to some. So.
I mean, there was a time when your tweeting PWG results literally added hundreds of followers to a Twitter account.
Yeah, man, that was back in the day, and rest in peace, PWG, I guess. But until Tony Khan decides to buy it or Chris Jericho decides to buy it and bring it back, who knows? But I've heard nothing. I'm just putting that out there because they're rich and they could easily afford it. And I'm sure Michael from High Spots is willing to make that kind of deal as long as he gets streaming footage, right? So you never know.
Yeah, I don't know, but let's stay focused here. We are discussing 1939 Stagecoach. Brian, Thomas Miller month continues here on the podcast, and I think it's fitting that with this movie, we are talking about the movie that he won his Best Supporting Actor Academy Award. So it's fitting, like this is the last Thomas Miller movie that we are discussing for the year. I mean, we could have made it a clean month. We could have talked about Gone with the Wind next week, but we are not going to. But Brian, indeed, this is the movie that Thomas Miller, of all the movies he appeared in 1939, this is the one he won an Academy Award for, and I would say it's well deserved. I think of the three movies, and I will never ever see Gone with the Wind, this is, I think, his best performance.
Of the three, yes, and Thomas Mitchell is an incredible, like I mentioned last week, character actor, side actor that's never necessarily in the starring role, but just elevates the movie. And he certainly elevates the role in this one as like a drunk doctor that's kind of like kicked out of town because he's a drunk by this like women's league that wants morality cleansed in their town. Huh?
Because here we go again. Thomas Miller's drunk again.
Yes, he is. And listen, if he was in Wizard of Oz, because I think he would have been a better wizard than the guy who played the wizard in Wizard of Oz.
I strongly disagree with you on this.
But there is no alcohol in Wizard of Oz, so it wouldn't have worked anyway. So. Yeah, there you go. But, yeah, this plot is very interesting because it's like the strangers coming together plot, and I like those kind of plots. That's obviously like a trope that's even in modern pop culture today, this idea of strangers meeting on a train, strangers meeting in a stagecoach, strangers meeting on a plane, that kind of thing. We've talked about a few movies like that before, but in this case, it's, this Western setting, and it takes place I think it's 1865, 1880. So it's way after the Civil War, but there's still the lingering effects of the Civil War, and the hostility's still there. And they even mentioned someone said it was the War of Independence, and then someone corrected them nope, it was the War of Rebellion. And I kept helping thinking of the January 6th thing where people call it a peaceful protest or whatever they want to call it, or was it a rebellion? And it's this distinctive thing of what your perspective is and what you want to call it.
It's almost as if people try to obfuscate what actually happens. It's really interesting how they do that.
The view never changes, baby. The view never changes, so to speak.
I mean, it's been the month. I mean, the thing is that people, I think, really try. Not all people, but I think there is a very ahistorical view of America. And if you go back through history, I think you will see a remarkable amount of patterns and just the way that things develop. And I think people who don't see the patterns, and I think people who kind of look to 1939, idealize it as this great time. I mean, look, there were elements of 1939 that probably were better, but my God, in 1939, you're still talking about the Depression. You're talking about complete lack of technology, a lack of health care. I mean, you're just talking about a time of a lot of segregation. I mean, again, the thing is that the idea that the view never changes, it's because the institutional issues that we faced in 1939 are so similar. And I think a lot of these movies have really brought them up. I mean, think about the way that Dallas is treated in this movie. Dallas is a character, and she is a sex worker, and she is very much discriminated against by everybody else. And in a lot of ways, she is not even seen as a human being. And I think that is something that we still have to deal with today. And I think Claire Trevor adds a lot of humanity to it. And I love the way that she plays the role. I think she does a great job. And I think the overall big issue that I have that I want to bring up is that, you have this group of Karens who basically kick her out of the town for being a sex worker. And that's literally stuff that's still going on today. You still have this very prude attitude about sex work, and I would say it's less than it was in 1939. But let's be clear: prostitution is the world's oldest profession. It will never ever go away, and I think this movie kind of represents that extremely well.
Yeah, and I think that scene with her carrying the baby is probably one of the more powerful shots in the movie. That's not an action sequence, because it just kind of speaks to what you were saying. It's she can be this great mother, and people don't see her as this great mother figure, right? And she's doing a great job doing it. And then also you mentioned the lack of health care.
They will always see her as a whore and a tramp, and that's it.
Yeah. And you mentioned the lack of health care. It's having a baby, and remember, this is not 1939. This movie takes place in 1880. So this idea of having a baby in 1880 is far more dangerous than having a baby now, because you are risking so much not having the proper medical care, treatment, facilitators to have you to make sure your baby's coming out healthy and you're not having any complications. And because I'm sure women were dying much faster having babies in that era than they are now, obviously because of the medical care. We've always heard these stories about women dying because some complications going wrong. So that's why that scene of her having the baby, I think, is so more dramatic in this era than it would be in now, because it's there's a high risk of that woman dying, much higher. So I think that scene really elevates the drama before the action sequence at the end. But I think her having that baby really kind of shows the humanity of some of the characters. It allowed Claire Trevor to kind of show, I mentioned, her motherly qualities, because people think she's an outcast as a prostitute. And then it kind of gives Doc Boone, Thomas Mitchell, his not redemption, but it shows you that he's still a great doctor, even though he's a drunk, but he's still got the skills to perform medical miracles when it comes to having babies in 1880. So I think that scene was really cool, in terms of bringing characters together, some of the characters you still don't like, and some of them get their comeuppance. Like that bank dude does get arrested for doing some corrupt shit.
Oh my
but
god!
still,
So can we talk about The View Never Changes with that guy when he talks about he wants a businessman as president? I mean, come on, it's all there.
that's one of the reasons why I didn't go back on social media for the last 7 days or so because of the same type of shit going on today. Oh my goodness!
But you're talking about a terrible human being who only cares about himself. He is a business person, and the only thing that he cares about is business. He doesn't care about human beings. And again, that is something that I think still remains true to this day. And I want to point out, John Ford is an incredibly conservative individual, and he is the one that is pointing this out. And again, I'm gonna have a lot to say about John Ford very shortly in terms of how he portrays indigenous culture. But I want to point out that the most evil person among that group of individuals, let's say the white people, it is the businessman who is very greedy. I just want to point that out.
And he gets his comeuppance because as soon as he gets off the stagecoach, after all that, he gets arrested. And then I guess he doesn't realize he was being arrested, but clearly they knew something was up with his finances at the bank or something that he wasn't really keen on. So that was a cool moment because I was like, wait, why did he get arrested? And then you realize he did some shit. And I was like, oh, good. That motherfucker deserves it. Because he was also complaining about the army not being there at certain forts to protect them because they're busy. They got shit to do. They can't just stay in one area and it's like, I pay my taxes. We pay our taxes. You need to be here and protect us. Blah blah blah. And it's like, dude, that does not how it's not how it works. That's not how the law works, even in 1880. So I thought that was a really cool poignant thing.
I am not the most pro military person, but if you think I'm going to yell at a soldier in their face, that would be a very poignant
in 1880, after all the shit they've gone through in the last 20 years,
especially in 1880 after Civil War. Yes,
it's so messed up. But I'm glad that guy gets his comeuppance. And yeah, so I guess we got to talk about what you want to talk about. John Carradine first or John Wayne? Because I got some stuff to say about John Carradine.
I mean, I think John Carradine does a really good job in this movie. I think the performances in this movie are really, really good. I think the thing that holds me back from truly appreciating every aspect of this movie is the level of racism that's involved, and there is a lot, but John Carradine is really good.
So basically, when Bela Lugosi neglected to come back for some of his Dracula roles in the Universal run, John Carradine took his place. So if you watch Frankenstein meets Dracula or The Wolfman or whatever, that Dracula is going to be portrayed by John Carradine. And I was joking with Jerome because every time I see him on screen, you could have told me that this guy was a real life vampire, and I would have believed you because he just has this look where he's thin and he's got this scary look sometimes, even though he's just trying to be serious. All he's doing here in this movie is trying to protect the pregnant woman, and I just can't help but think there's something bad, something evil is going to happen with this dude. He's a bad dude, and he almost does something bad at the end, but it was almost like a mercy kill that he almost did, which is kind of crazy because he thought, I guess, he was going to die too. So, but luckily they got out of that jam. He didn't shoot the woman out of a mercy killing, which also leads me to my other quick rant. This whole idea of a mercy killing that really pissed me off at the end of The Mist. And I thought The Mist was going so great with the creatures and the effects and stuff, and then it just has that downer ending that was not necessary at all, where he kills all the family members and almost kills himself, Thomas Jane, and then he realizes that the army could have just saved him 5 minutes earlier. I was like, oh, come on, dude. So this idea of mercy killing was kind of it's very ugh. It kind of disgusts me a little bit, but luckily the timing saved that woman because I was like, man, you better not shoot that woman. Because after all that she's been through trying to find her husband and having that baby, and you're going to shoot her just because you think that the Native Americans are going to do worse to her. So I was just kind of conflicted on that. But still, I think John Carradine is a great character actor as well. And like I said, he's a good Dracula. He's not nearly as good as Bela Lugosi, but he's got that vampire look, and he seems like a guy that can live forever based on the way he looks, and maybe even like a Dorian Gray type. But man, he's got that very strange, borderline gothic look to him, even though he's in a Western in this, but he's still got that mustache. It's just that look he's got too. And his kids are David Carradine and the other Carradine, right? They're all related. I forgot to look that up.
Keith Carradine?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I think they're his kids. Yeah. So
let's look that up. Why don't you talk about John Wayne while I do that?
So John Wayne, this is one of his first starring roles, and obviously he's known as this Western genre legend. And if you look at his work, the older he gets, the more stoic and John Wayne-ish. Like everyone does a John Wayne impression partner, and it's usually the John Wayne of like older, like 50s, 60s John Wayne. In this case, he's kind of got that young gun kind of feel to him. And I like this role that he does because it's like it's not its usual howdy partner self. Like if you watch Rio Bravo with Dean Martin, he's got the gimmick down. Here it's almost like he's learning how to be a star, and it's really cool because like he shows some vulnerability that he doesn't usually show in other roles, and like some weaknesses. Like he clearly is like he's a criminal on the run trying to get revenge for his family, right? But then he gets on the stagecoach, and the one officer on the stagecoach is like telling him like, once we get to town, I'm going to arrest you. There's nothing I can do. Like there's a warrant out for you or whatever. And then by the end of the movie, they get away from that, and the guy gets his revenge, or John Wayne gets his revenge or whatever. But he's basically a cavalry soldier, and he's still young. And I don't think like he probably went through the Civil War as well, but at a much younger age, right? So he's got this like baggage to him. And he's just really like trying to look out for the good guy, and he's trying to do the right thing when it comes to these people that he kind of feels like he's burdened himself to these people in the stagecoach, knowing that he's going to be arrested, or he's like a criminal on the run, sort of, even though he's still in his cavalry gear. So it's a really interesting character because he does have his redemption at the end, and you know he's going to do the right thing, and he helped a lot. I mean, like it wasn't him, but his stuntman jumped from like horse to horse to horse to get to the lead horse of the carriage in order to in order to correct the path and get away from the Native Americans. It was such an incredible visual that we'll talk about more of in a little bit. But his journey throughout the movie is really interesting, and like he shows compassion and like falls in love with Claire Trevor. And it's weird to me because you think he's this traditional conservative guy, yet he's got this character that's falling in love with a prostitute and is willing to cross the border illegally and stay in Mexico.
But if there's one thing that conservatives love to do, it's to rescue hookers, whores, and ne'er-do-wells. Like that actually is a very conservative idea.
That's Pretty Woman right there. And then take.
I mean, not even necessarily Pretty Woman. It's just the idea of, okay, I am a man who is going to set you straight. You will no longer be a prostitute because you are going to get married to me, a rugged, real man. That to me is the idea. And again, that is, in my view, a very conservative way of thinking. I mean, I think John Wayne, his gimmick is not something that I'm super into at all. I think John Ford is a great director, but man, just getting through a John Wayne movie when he's in full gimmick, it would just be really, really hard. I think this is kind of a really good balance because John Wayne is kind of part of the crew, but like it's also very clear that John Ford sees him as a star. The way that he makes his entrance, the things that he does within the movie, in the action scene especially, like this is very clearly designed to be showcasing John Wayne as a potential future star.
And like the way he's holding a gun and the way he's like kind of posing, you can't help but think of like Ash and Evil Dead. At least to me, it's like this idea of like we got to have that cool pose.
I was not thinking about that, but okay.
But I mean, think about it. Like the way he's holding the gun and the way Ash holds the gun, almost the same way because he's got one hand and it's that kind of gun where I guess we got to load the bottom or crank the bottom. So I mean, I was thinking like that, and I was like, man, maybe John Wayne had more of an influence on like being a star in Hollywood than more so his performances, because like he is like a star. Like in this movie, he portrays that well, and he comes off like a star. And of course, you got Thomas Mitchell as Doc Boone, who recognized them as a kid. Like, hey, didn't I treat you when you were a kid? It's like, are you Doc Boone? And then they have this connection. So you got this kind of like Obi-Wan, Luke kind of connection, older, wiser gentleman trying to help the younger kid. So I like that relationship that they kind of rekindled from their past. And then, they have this good relationship. And then everyone else is kind of like in it for themselves, but those two are just trying to do the right thing, even though Doc is drunk all the time. And the stuff Doc was doing to that other dude, that other businessman who got the arrow and somehow lived. I don't know if you noticed that he lived. That dude got the arrow in the chest, but
he did. That took me by surprise. I was not expecting to see somebody get shot with an arrow right to the chest. And it popped me. Like, it definitely got the sequence going. And again, I think I attribute that to John Ford being a really good director.
Yeah, and before that all happens is just the fact that Doc Boone was just trying to like do these like drunk things. To, like, you know, you can almost see like a Philip Seymour Hoffman in this role doing that kind of thing as well. If he were in that role, just being a fun drunk and then getting serious at the right time, and then
Yeah, I can see that.
sobering up, and then delivering the baby. And I thought it was funny too because I forgot to mention Only Angels Have Wings had this one scene where Cary Grant's trying to straighten up because he was too drunk and he had to fly. So the obvious thing to do in 1939 is just splash cold water on your face and then have someone slap you and then you're just ready to go. So they did the same thing with Doc Boone, and I was like, that's hilarious. That's the cure for a hangover or being
This is
drunk.
when alcoholism was acceptable, Brian. We didn't have the stigma
It's
around
tough,
alcohol.
and I just cold water on my face and I'm gonna deliver this baby, and that's what happened. But it all builds up to, you know,
I mean,
this.
look, if you told me that I had to deliver a baby and I was drunk, that would sober me up too. I don't know
Yeah.
that I could deliver a baby,
1980,
but it would
so many things
definitely
going
get
on.
me there.
Yeah. So it builds up to the last 20 minutes where it's this. They've been teasing Geronimo and his savageness, and that's kind of where that racism comes from, and a lot of racism against Native Americans in this movie. But the action
I mean,
sequence
they
itself,
might as well be faceless. They don't get any lines. They don't get any development whatsoever. They are just the savages who are going to chase after the white people. That's literally what their role
and
is.
they've been avoiding him the whole time, and they felt like they'd be getting lucky. And then till the last 20 minutes of the movie, we see the arrow go to the dude's chest who lived, but then all of a sudden shit goes down, and then everything sort of becomes like a modern action movie, and it's still like incredible to this day because I watched this first time in college about 15, 20 years ago, and like it was just like, wow, this is like way ahead of its time. And then you watch it now in HD, and it's like, wow, this guy really knew how to cut and where to cut and how to cut from like wide angle shots of like the actual desert with actual horses coming around, and then cut to a close up inside the carriage where it's obviously a set, but it blends so well together. So I think the editing in this sequence was great. We talk about this stunt that it's obviously not John Wayne, but it's John Wayne's character, Ringo Kid. He has to jump from the beginning of the carriage where the horses are to the lead horse in order to change the direction of the carriage to make sure they get away. And somehow they did it in one take, and it's this wide shot, and you actually see the carriage, the stagecoach with the horses, and this stunt man is jumping from like, it's not even like one horse to one horse. He's attaching himself like to two horses at once with the left leg and the right leg, and he's jumping and jumping and jumping, and somehow gets to the front. And I'm like, well, this is real. And like, if this was done today, this would be CGI clearly. And it was just incredible because it was real.
And it's a shame. It's a shame that it would be CGI because I mean, I don't know that I want real horses doing all this stuff, and maybe it is better that it's CGI. But to be honest, I mean, I think this holds up as good as anything in the movie. I mean, you would not know this was shot 85 years ago. I think it is mostly seamless, and it looks unbelievable. And just some of the shots, it's like they did it because they just did it, and that's really impressive. I mean, when they have multiple characters like going across the horses, I mean, that's really impressive. And the fact that John Ford doesn't really cut it, so you can kind of tell that someone, I'm sure it's a stunt double, is actually doing this. I mean, it is a long shot, but like the fact that Ford shows us that the person is actually doing it, I mean, that to me is like, that is the magic of movie making.
Yeah, and I still like, we got to talk about the arrows because there is at least 3 or 4 shots where it looked like the only way to do the shot is to actually shoot an arrow, and hopefully the actor's not hit by the arrow. Am I right or wrong on this? Because there's no other way to do it in 39. There's no CGI, and it didn't even look like they filmed it backwards, which is another way you do it. But
I mean, I'm sure that I'm sure that the arrows were quote unquote real, but they were probably dulled in some way.
And they're literally going into the wood next to the person's head, and I was just like, oh my God, like, you couldn't have paid me to do that. You know what I mean? And fucking Claire Trevor at one point just looks out the window, the fucking arrow goes on the next to her head, and she's just like staring like as if she just like survived. Like a real life fucking like arrow coming to her head, and I just kept thinking like, that was real. I'm gonna just assume that was real because there's no other way to do it. And then of course the wide shots with the Native Americans and the sheer size of their army, or not army, but like group of people. The way he blended it together with the editing, I think, is incredible because I read that he blended in shots from Utah and Arizona, which he liked to shoot at, John Ford, mixed in with the local Chatsworth stuff, which I've seen before every time I go on the freeway, and I recognize all these mountains and stuff from past movies. So he cuts from that to that, and then cuts to the inside, and it's just like everything is seamless, even though he's got 3 different locations in one shot, or not one shot, but like one sequence, and everything just seems so seamless. So he just knew how to do like proper things. Like there's one point where John Wayne is staring out into the desert, and then he just looks to the left, and you can tell he's on a set. But when you cut to what he's looking at, that's the real wide angle shot from like Arizona or whatever it is. So like in terms of editing, this is like a masterclass in terms of like mixing things up and blending things together to make it look good. And then I also mentioned like last week, Only Angels Have Wings. It's a credit to them being in black and white because you could blend in so much more. So I think in this case, doing it in black and white, and if you compare the quality of this and Wizard of Oz, like it's clear like Wizard of Oz is like on a level on its own, but still like the ability to do this in black and white and blend it all together and have that amazing sequence at the end. And then even the way that the last shootout is done, which is not even on the stagecoach, it's like the last 5 minutes of the movie where Ringo Kid, John Wayne, gets his revenge on those dudes that killed his family.
Yeah,
like,
that's also well done.
Yeah,
it helps that they shoot in the dark.
Yeah, and like the way they play with
That helps.
shadows, it's great. Because I think Westerns, when they're done right and they have these great shootouts, it's either done well in the middle of the day or it's these dark, shadowy nights where they have these shootouts. And I've seen it before, and the way they play with shadows is really well done. So it's really like John Ford really like influenced a lot of like modern filmmakers, Western filmmakers at the time.
Yeah.
And then of course, if you were a fan of Akira Kurosawa, which I am, Akira Kurosawa's number one hero is John Ford. And then I think there's like a quote or something like, "Where did you learn how to make all your movies?" and blah blah blah. He's like, John Ford, John Ford, John Ford. So, and then of course that connects to the modern era because Akira Kurosawa was the one that influenced George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese. So it's all goes back to John Ford.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely one of those things where you can have conflicted feelings about who John Ford is as a human being because I mean it very clearly made some incredibly racist movies. I'm sure this is not the only one. I'm sure that a lot of his other movies would fall into this trap as well. But you can't deny the influence that he also had over the history of movie making as well. And I think this movie is a really good example of that. And just the way that his career evolved and what he was able to do, it's really impressive. I mean, this is a guy who was making silent movies and then seamlessly transitioned into making movies with such an epic scope throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s. And it would continue. I mean, he and John Wayne had a very long and fruitful relationship, and there were a lot of great collaborations between them. And, you know, John Ford was actively involved in the war effort as well in terms of some of the movies he did, and then continuing on afterward. I mean, he has a very interesting career, and I think it is worth discussing. And anytime you discuss it, you have to discuss his everything about him.
He also won Best Director for this movie too, and it was the first time he won Best Director. Actually, he won Best Director for The Informer as well. It looks like, but he's won like 4 other times, so he's top quality level in terms of like winning.
4 Best Director wins. He won for The Informer, The Grapes of Wrath, How Green Was My Valley, and The Quiet Man.
He was nominated for Stagecoach. Yeah.
All 4 of the movies he won, none of them were westerns. I think that's really interesting that he won 4, but none of them were for the genre that he is probably most famous for.
Yeah, and I think that he's committed to his craft too, because if you look at like pictures of him, the older he got, the more he kind of relied on his right eye for like, because he's obviously looking at the camera, so he would put on a patch on his left eye, and I was just like, dude, you're committed, man, because obviously that patch probably did help in terms of like sequencing shots and kind of framing shots inside the camera, because you're only focused on the one eye, but still, like, that's just committed to the craft, man. Like, he's almost sacrificing his own vision just for the art. So I thought that was a really cool, thing that I learned about John Ford, and that I think Akira Kurosawa did the same thing. It's like when he was on like sets, he would just put on the patch because he was more focused on that visual on the right eye than the left anyway. So really cool stuff to learn about John Ford and how he did things and his influence and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that this is a movie that it has been remade a couple times. And personally, I have no interest in seeing either of the remakes, but I could see this being the type of movie that would get remade because I think it generally leads to you could get a really great group of actors together, put them in, and this is a great actor showcase. As much as we've talked about the directing, which is really impressive in its own right, this is also a really great showcase for so many of the actors. I think that's, you look at Thomas Mitchell winning an Academy Award for this movie. You look at what it did for John Wayne's career. You look at what it even did for some of the supporting players as well. But Brian, there's one part of the movie that we have to talk about before we end this podcast. Do you know what it is?
I think we talked about everything, but if you got something, let's fire it up.
The music. We haven't talked about the music.
What, the lack of music? Because it's hardly recognizable, right?
It won Best Score it won Best Score. So I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know, man. Like, to me, this movie is all about the visual. The score is secondary.
This score is pretty iconic. I definitely have heard this score used in other places. It is a definite.
Maybe it's just in my subconscious that I just didn't realize it was like a thing. You know what I mean? Maybe I just heard it so many times with other things that I just kind of blended it in my subconscious. I don't know, but that's interesting that I didn't even pick up on like a good soundtrack, but you did. But me, I was more focused on like the editing, I guess, because again, I was obsessed with like that last 20 minutes and how they just did everything. But yeah, I mean, I also credit to the composer as well. I mean, this movie is very well rounded, for sure, and it's easy to see why like this appealed to a lot of people at the time. And we talked about last week where how like a lot of these movies at the time were trying to appeal to the general audience, not necessarily niche audiences, and this kind of covers a lot of those bases.
And as mentioned, it is also incredibly racist. So if that is something, if you believe that is unacceptable, I think that's also completely, totally reasonable. I as much as there are enjoyable aspects of this movie, I think there is a very strong case to be made as well for certain individuals that what is done here to the indigenous culture is not only something that shouldn't be repeated, but probably isn't worth honoring. So I can certainly understand individuals. I mean, look, we are not reviewing Gone with the Wind because I refuse to watch it. So everybody has those lines, and certainly they should be respected.
For sure. So my final rating is an 8 out of 10, and that's mainly because of the technical aspects. And script is okay.
7.5.
But you can't help but think, like, I felt like Quentin Tarantino tried to just recreate this with Hateful Eight, and even though he couldn't actually remake Stagecoach, but there are elements in that movie where it takes place in a stagecoach with a lot of conversation, and then a bunch of strangers meeting up.
I was thinking about that too. I mean, I really like Hateful Eight, and it definitely has a lot of the same vibes as this movie in terms of being kind of more of a ensemble than just a strict two-hander or whatever.
But if I were to pick, I think I like Stagecoach more because it's just so like amazing to watch that sequence, that one sequence.
I mean, if you're asking me, the best sequence in either of the two movies is the 20 minutes of chasing. But if you ask me which movie I would prefer, I would say Hateful Eight.
I get that. It's just Hateful Eight is so long in comparison to this too, and I feel like this covers
the
same ground.
It definitely is. That also is going to be an issue for people. And there's racism in that movie too. There's a lot of N-words being dropped.
And a lot of hateful things to women. But again, that's
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
But again, he was trying to recreate this feel, I believe, because he loves these westerns too. He loves Rio Bravo more than this, but again, like we talked about Rio Bravo when we talked about Assault on Precinct 13, about that, this town being invaded and John Wayne hiding himself and barricading himself with some other people fighting back. So again, that was John Ford. So again, it's just this idea that John Ford is just so influential in terms of like modern movie making and tropes and all these ideas of strangers coming together on random like vehicles and stuff. Like, yeah, that all goes back to John Ford. So.
All right, Brian. So that is it for our conversation on Stagecoach. Next week is Thanksgiving, and there is only one movie to talk about during the course of Thanksgiving. It is the Thanksgiving evening tradition, The Wizard of Oz, the original, the 1939. You know what? I said original. That's not true. There were other versions that came out before. There have been other versions since. With Wicked coming out very soon, we thought, why not talk about The Wizard of Oz? I mean, thematically, it fits in with this being 1939 month. So, Brian, next week we are going to talk about The Wizard of Oz, a movie that has probably been talked to death, watched to death. I don't know that we're going to have anything new to add to the conversation, but I know that you and I are going to show a lot of love to this movie.
Oh, the colors, the colors, the colors. That's always the thing that draws me to Wizard of Oz. Every time I watch it on TV once a year, it's just those amazing, amazing colors and the way they did it for 1939. It's still, with the HD transfer, looks fucking amazing.
Yeah, I think that it's gonna be a lot of fun. So for Brian, I am Jerome. We will talk to you again next week.